Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. My name is Dan Hafner. As always, welcome back to any previous listeners. Welcome to any new listeners. We're talking about SaaS pricing today. This is going to be a very, very interesting show. I have a very cool guest by the name of James D. Wilton, who is on the line here. I'm going to bring him in 1 second. But how do you price a SaaS? Like, how do you figure out what's going to land? What is it worth? How do you figure out? Oh, is this going to land right? Am I charging too much? Am I not charging enough? How do I balance this whole thing? As someone who develops things, not only for myself, for my clients, like it's a very interesting conversation. So I'm very excited to have him kind of come on here and shed some light on this for all of you guys out there who are interested in this topic. So before I bring him in, as always, please like, subscribe, rate, review the show wherever you're listening or watching. That is super, super helpful. And obviously, share this episode with anyone you think might find value in it. So without any further ado, welcome to the show, James. How are you, man?
I'm good. Happy to be here, Dan. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited to talk to you about all this. So, it looks like you're a founder and managing partner at Monevate, which is a consulting firm focused on monetization for fast growing tech companies. Very interesting. So,
Correct.
so what is Monevate?
You described it pretty well. It's a pricing strategy focused consulting firm. We mainly work with, let's just say, fast growing tech companies. A large part of those are, we call it SaaS, right? It's like anything as a service, and practically a lot of that is SaaS. A lot of those businesses are SaaS businesses, but they don't have to be, right? There's a lot of other types of businesses that just have either do or have aspirations to sell their products via a recurring revenue model. We really work with all businesses in that kind of a business, really, to be able to better monetize their products and better capture the value that they are creating for their customers.
Okay, awesome. So how did you get into this world of SaaS? I always love to hear everyone's origin story. How'd you get into it?
Well, it wasn't sort of purposefully. There was no grand plan at the beginning. I just kind of took a series of steps that just drifted me there ultimately. But
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I guess quick sort of background on me. I've been a consultant for pretty much my entire career. I decided that relatively early that I wanted to be a consultant. I kind of felt like the skills that consultants needed were a good fit for what I was looking to do
Yeah.
back when I was younger. But I started off in sales and marketing, mainly for pharmaceutical companies. I work with a company called ZS Associates, who kind of helped pharmaceutical companies optimize the efforts of their sales force. So I did that for a few years, stayed in consulting and pivoted slightly. I got more into strategy and operations, and then I ended up getting into pricing and indirectly into SaaS through chance, really. I'd been at a consulting firm after business school for a couple of years. I had my first kid, and at that time, like, the consulting world was still very much a mandatory 4-day-a-week travel model, right? So I basically saw my son at weekends for the first 6 months of his life or
Oh,
so,
wow.
which uh, which wasn't great, and that wasn't what I was looking to achieve. So I kind of knew that I had to go and do something else, but I didn't know I didn't know what I would do. I was kind of really identified as a consultant, and I liked it. In long story short, I ended up getting headhunted by this internal consulting team for a big company called Relex Group, which historically was all in information, sort of journals and so forth, but was moving into tech around that time. They were building a lot of tools and programs around their information. And this
Okay.
internal consulting firm focused on pricing, which I hadn't really done anything of at the time. But what was brought to me was they would teach me the pricing. I would probably like it, and then I'd get much better work-life balance to go along with the consulting work that I wanted to do. And as it turns out, I just found out that I loved it. It was way more strategic than I was expecting, and there was a lot more room for creativity as well. So I was kind of hooked. I did that for a fair few years. I was there at Rolex for about 4 years, and by the end of that, I decided that I wanted to go back into external consulting, but I just wanted to focus on pricing. And so I got deeper and deeper into pricing, and then deeper into pricing for SaaS companies specifically. I did a lot of work at a company called SBI, where I built a pricing practice, and then I went to work for a larger consulting firm called McKinsey, where I led the pricing practice for fast growth tech. So it's basically McKinsey trying to work with tech startups and scale ups who, the McKinsey didn't typically work with, right? They much more frequently work with these much larger enterprise style companies. So work with these guys, help them use pricing as a way to boost their revenue growth. And I just found that I really liked that. It was the topic that I was most interested in, and the type of companies that I was most interested in as well. So I loved it, and I loved it enough that having spent a few years there, I decided that I wanted to found my own consulting firm, which was specifically focused around that space, right? Let's try to be the best-in-class provider of pricing strategy consulting to smaller tech and SaaS companies who are really looking to use pricing strategy as a mechanism to drive greater revenues over time.
Very cool. That's a great story. Very, very neat. Very neat. Okay, so you brought up a couple of things. First thing I want to dive into is, you know, like packaging your SaaS, packaging your product. I remember getting into this whole world with the likes of like Russell Brunson in the marketing world. I think that's kind of how a lot of people kind of maybe started. Um,
Mhm.
and and they talk about that offer stack, right? Like, hey, when you finally pitch this offer, you not it's almost like you say, hey, if I'm going to give you A and B and C and D and E and F and then all the way to P, and the total value of all of that is actually $25,000. But just today, it's going to be this 1997 price tag or something like that, right?
Right.
Is
Yeah.
something like that like a similar way of packaging like a software product, or is there something completely different that you kind of recommend for people?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, when we use the word packaging, the way we would use it within Monevate, right, is to think about how do you break your offering up into smaller parts that you can sell separately, right, and provide that kind of option A, B, and C. Is that the way that you're thinking about it, Dan? Or are you thinking more about the how do we kind of position our price level like it's worth this, but we're just charging this for it?
Well, I guess I'm leaving that to you. I mean, I know that I've played around in both parts of it. Like we've
Yeah,
done
yeah.
projects where we had like that, where you have option A, like a lot of software, right? There's the free version, and then there's the starter version, and then the professional version, and the enterprise version, and they kind of stack up like that, which is kind of what I think you're talking about. And then I've also done projects where we kind of did offer stacks like that, where there was kind of offline things of the software there where there was coaching or consulting tied in with
Gotcha.
software as well. So I mean, I guess I kind of screwed
Either
up that
or.
question a little bit. Yeah, but no, I'm just kind
No,
of
no,
interested.
no.
Like, what's a let me rephrase the question. Let's ask it this way. Like, what's one of the best ways that you see around how you package something to make it
Gotcha.
so it's irresistible. It's very valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, well, thinking about packaging is definitely one of the key parts of building a pricing strategy, right? We always say there's an expression in pricing that is pretty well known. I don't know who said it first, but it's definitely something I agree with, which is how you price is more important than what you price, right? Which basically means the structure around your pricing, the way you structure your offerings, the way that you scale price, and the way that you position how your price scales is ultimately going to is going to make you more likely to be successful than just kind of finding the right specific price level. And frankly, if you've got that system where you can position your price appropriately and scale it, then the right price levels will more naturally follow, right, within that.
Mhm.
So that's definitely true. Packaging is a big part of that, right? Because packaging is basically how you break your software product down into different purchasable units. The most common type of packaging you see all the time is that kind of classic good, better, best idea, right? Where you have an entry version that's just a little bit of the product. The middle version adds a bit more, and then you usually have a premium version which includes everything, right? It's not the only way of packaging, but that is very, very common within the SaaS space. It's very
Mhm.
simple. And it's helpful for a number of reasons, right? I think firstly, like the obvious way of doing it is that it helps you capture more of your value from the market, right? If you're a company and you say, here is our product, and this all is, you basically got one price point that you can put out there, assuming you're not scaling the price for it by anything else. You just have that one price point there. So you're going to end up with some companies which maybe that price point for everything is too much for them. And if you could give them something sort of slightly less for a lower price point, they would happily buy something. So you kind of lost out on those. And also, if you're kind of just selling your single offering there are probably some companies which would pay a lot more, but you can't price it higher to those guys because you would miss out on a whole bunch of the sort of the middle market around that. So you lose some of your ability to price differentiate by only having one offering. So that's incredibly helpful, right? It means you can start thinking about what are the different customer segments I'm going to be serving? What are their needs? How can I align a different offering for each one of those segments and price it appropriately so I can capture, all of those segments at the right price level? And, actually, if you end up doing the math of that, just by doing that, you will end up capturing probably something like an additional 30% revenue and significantly more profit just by doing that tiering. So that's super powerful.
Wow.
But it's also really important because it's kind of counterintuitive, but it makes it more likely that people will actually buy your product if you give them choices within that. There are a lot of early startups will just give you one product and say, here's our product, take it or leave it. But if you do that to a customer, it's very simple, right? I understand it. I've only got one option there, but I haven't got anything to compare it to. So like if it's not exactly what I want, I haven't got anywhere else to go. And it's a bit, it actually there've been behavioral economics studies done that show in that kind of environment, a customer is less likely to make a purchase decision in that moment than if you gave them two or three simple options and say, hey, pick A, B, or C. The fact that you have options there makes it more likely that they'll end up choosing something, regardless what it is.
That's
So
very interesting because I mean, I think that's it's almost like when you think about buying a car, like everyone loves to buy a car, but you don't want to be sold a car. Right? So it's like people love to self-select. Like I think about all the time you see these commercials
mhm,
for like Drive Time or Carvana or those types of things, and it's like they give the whole message of that commercial is you've got the power, like you drive the deal, and that's super empowering for people. And I love that you brought that up. Like it's more likely because again, coming back from that other mindset of like you just give people one thing to do and then boom, and like that that can be very powerful in certain situations, but in other things like this, I love going on different software platforms and seeing all the different plans, and then you get to
right.
actually you self-identify with that plan of like, oh, I'm not at the enterprise level, I'm at the professional level,
Exactly.
and that's really empowering. Yeah.
Exactly. You think it's not for me. And I think the car's a great example of that, right? Because, you might say, hey, look, I want to buy a car. My budget is, making it up $25,000, right? And somebody might say, hey, look, here's a car. It's $24,000. So there's a car there and it's within your budget, but you don't know whether that's a good deal or not, or whether, you actually want to buy that for $24,000. If they say, hey, look, here are three cars. There's this one car which, really just has the basics for $20,000. Here's one that has a bit more for $23,000, and here's one which is, you know, includes everything and a bit more for $27,000. Then you can kind of look at what's included in those different options and weigh up what the difference in value is to you and what your sort of willingness to pay for those areas, and ultimately select the place where you want to be. So it's a
Yeah.
very powerful technique for pricing, and I think that's why you see it so frequently. It's helpful for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into my next question was, like how do you actually figure out and determine what a customer is going to be willing to pay for something, right? Like because, I mean, I see this a lot in what I do, and I see it a lot in what other people do, is you can just there's a difference between, well, I believe what I value this at, but that doesn't mean that anyone else will pay that, right? There's a lot of different things I wanted to bring up in this, but like it's how do you and maybe we can use an example of an app that I'm launching actually very interestingly.
Yeah.
So like how do you actually determine is there a comparison game that's played there to say like, okay, I have this software, I compared to other products on the market, it might own like a lot of people that I'm building this that I compete against sell this for $10 a month or $100 a month. You know, what makes me think that I'm going to be able to charge $500 a month for this plan? Like
Yeah.
how do you go about this, figuring out what customers are going to be willing to pay?
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk through it. So I guess first off, just as just to talk about the concept of willingness to pay, right? I think that it is really difficult to get to willingness to pay for a number of different reasons. And it's really basically you think about when you're trying to price a product, right? There's a certain amount of actual value that this product gives to a specific customer, and it might be different across different customers. First off, that doesn't matter that much, right? What does matter is the actual perceived value that the customers see within that, which may be less than the actual value if you don't really communicate the value of what it is that you're offering in the right way. And I see companies do this all the time, right? They either don't understand how the customer gets value, so that's a problem from the start, right? They're not able to position it if you don't know it. You might know what type of value they're getting, but you can't quantify it, so you can't relay you can't relay exactly how much value is there. You might sort of know what you think should be valuable to them, but it's not actually the things that are valuable to the customer. So therefore you're talking about the wrong things and you're not sort of conveying all the value there. There's like all these reasons why ultimately you end up right from the beginning truncating what people will pay for your product because you haven't positioned it correctly, right? And then once you've got that perceived value, wherever that ended up, there is going to be a certain amount of willingness to pay for that value. But that's, you end up losing a bunch of value there as well, because customers are never going to have a willingness to pay that exactly matches that perceived value. Because firstly, nobody's going to give you $10 today in the hope that they're going to get $10 back in a year, right? Like you're always going to expect some kind of a return on whatever transaction you make. And that's true when you're buying a product as well. There's also expectations, right? Sometimes people will say, well, I can see the value in this, but I just don't think it's fair they're charging this much for it. So they'll push back on that. There's also competition, right? Like you might look at something I was about to sell you and I would say it's charged at $50 and you're like, yes, that sounds like a great deal. I'm all in. But then if you turn around and saw that actually 3 competitors were offering very similar products for $10, you're not going to be willing to pay $50 anymore, right? That just the fact that they are there has warped what your price to value expectation is within the market. So competitors will make a difference as well. And then there's budget. And people always tend to think that this is not really a part of willingness to pay. They think, if the value's there, people will pay for it. But it's not true, right? Because a lot of the times, if money was not, if access to sort of funds initially was not a factor, everybody would be throwing all of their money into the stock market, right? But you can't do that because you have needs, you have to buy certain things, you have to keep the lights on. So even though you think something is technically worth it, your willingness to pay may not be there because you just can't part with the cash, right? And that's going to be different for different customers, companies, individuals based on their own economic situations and scale and all the rest of it, right? So willingness to pay itself is a very complex thing that includes a lot of things. It's not static, it's going to change over time. And if you look at a customer base, even if you have a relatively simple customer base, say it's all consumers, you're going to have a variation in willingness to pay across all those consumers. I've done this experiments in classrooms with like a cup of coffee and say, hey, how much would everybody pay for a cup of coffee? And you get wildly different numbers that come from like, $1.50 on one end going up to like $15 on the other end. So there's this huge variation. So with that understanding, Dan, or that like that's what you really have to be able to do to be able to get to right price levels is understand the willingness to pay and how it varies across your customer base. And honestly, the best way of doing that, assuming that you have the resources to do it, is through research, right? Do run market research and try to figure out what are those different customer segments that you would be serving and what is the general willingness to pay within those different segments. Also, how do the needs differ? You might find that there are some segments who have very low willingness to pay, but also don't need as much stuff or don't need as high a quality product as say another segment with a much higher willingness to pay. And if you can understand how that willingness to pay differs, then you can start thinking about how do I build a price structure that gives what these different segments want at a price that they are willingness to pay. And that's the way to start your packaging. There are a number of different techniques that you can use. probably the most well, the most powerful in a consumer space would be conjoint, because then you literally can start saying, you define a bunch of different features or capabilities that your product offers. You give them a bunch of different price levels, and you use that to basically put a series of choices in front of these prospective customers and say, hey, look, if you got, option A, which includes X, Y, and Z, and it's $20, and you have option B, which includes even more than that and is now $50, which one of these would you pick, or would you pick nothing? And you can start using that to understand what the value of these different areas are to these different customer segments, and what is the general sort of price level they pay for it.
Yeah, no, that's genius. I mean, the two things I'm taking away from you right now, and just to summarize for the listeners, is like this ability to self-select, I think is super, super powerful. And then when you brought up the coffee cup example, it was very interesting because you think about, okay, I'm just going to have a cup of coffee, a cup of Starbucks coffee right on the table. What would you pay for this? And then I always remembered a lesson one of my mentors taught me, was it was always about perceived value, right? Because it's like, okay, if you said you'd pay $3 for this cup of coffee, but then all of a sudden I told you, well, actually, this was a cup of coffee that was actually purchased this morning by none other than Michael Jordan down the street from me.
Right.
And this was actually the last cup of coffee that he said he was ever going to buy at Starbucks, or like, something like that. Right. Or like, even like you talk about shoes or like any kind of physical
Yeah,
product.
yeah.
There's a perceived value. That thing has automatically gone up. I might be like, ooh, I'll give you $100 for that. If
Yeah,
that if
exactly.
that's valuable to me, if that perceived value, if I can self-identify and self-select, that's like, oh, I actually don't give a crap about Michael Jordan, so that doesn't affect me at all. Oh, actually, I grew up Michael Jordan's biggest fan ever. I'll give you $1,000 for that cup of coffee. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah,
So,
exactly.
no, this ability to really self-select, I think, is very, very interesting. So, one thing I actually want to ask you, and this kind of ties into my next question of like the common like pitfalls around like, pricing products and things like that.
Yep.
Um, do you ever work with anyone, or have you ever done this approach of the, I know it's a big thing in some of the online software sales now, of like these lifetime licenses,
Yep.
lifetime products. I'm curious, what are your opinions on all of those? Of like, hey, if I'm launching a product, or I sell this one time sale, instead of saying I want to have it as $9 a month, it's going to be a one time cost of $149 ever. Right? What are some of the pros and cons about that? Do you ever suggest people do that? Do you suggest people don't do that? I'm just curious on your thoughts around that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is, in my line of work, rarely would we suggest that, right? I mean, it's hard to ever say never. I feel like every time I say never, I end up I end up regretting it,
Yeah.
because there's usually some exception. But it would be very unusual for that, right? And the reason is because if you're doing something on just kind of a one time basis, and you own it outright, you're underselling your value over time, right? And that's why, you go back about 10, 12 years ago, so many companies were moving from these perpetual license type models, where you just buy it once and you are done, maybe with a sort of a low maintenance fee, into the subscription world. It's because the lifetime value of that revenue stream, if you have something on that recurring basis, is just generally going to be so much higher than it is
Hmm.
in that perpetual license. I actually, I say that a lot of the movement from perpetual license to subscription has already been done. I used to work on it a ton when I was originally starting out in pricing. But around that time, right, I think, if you have like something that you're selling on a perpetual license that was, say, priced at 100, right, and maybe you're charging $20 a year as this kind of maintenance fee that would come up afterwards. Generally, if you were moving to subscription, rule of thumb, customers will pay about 40 to 60 per year on that basis, right? So 40 to 60% of what that perpetual license price would be.
Okay.
So you have to consider margins and everything, but I mean, suffice to say, it doesn't take many years until the subscription revenue stream is making you way more money over time than that perpetual license model is. So it's, all that's to say, generally you are going to be better off with that recurring revenue model.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it just mathematically makes sense. I'm just interested. And I wonder if I'm giving people terrible advice because the one thing that I found that worked for me early on, and that I've actually encouraged some of my clients to do, whether they choose to do it or not, it's up to them. But is actually have a launch type of perpetual license limited time offer that
Yep.
is kind of, and you have to be in integrity with this. Obviously, you have to say like, hey, for this month, it's the perpetual license at $197. It's the only chance it's ever going to be available. And but what that did for me when I've launched one of my first products, that gave me such a big cash flow up front because I
Yeah.
started with next to $0. And that gave me like a huge influx of cash and like actual customers to get data off of and feedback from. And I obviously knew I wasn't going to make money off of those people ever again. But what
Yeah.
that allowed me to do was then to go out and get, more feedback and then put money into, hey, we're going to switch that back down to a recurring thing. Um, so I assume that's like a halfway decent idea, right?
Oh, 100%. Like,
Yeah.
well, this is one of those situations, but I'm glad I didn't say never, Dan, actually, right? Because I think what you're talking about there, no, it does. I mean, it's a consideration, right? And like, actually it brings on to one of the biggest points around pricing, which is there's no universally right pricing strategy for any business, right? Like I think people tend to think like within my segment there is a right way of doing this, and that's not true, right? The reality is that the right pricing strategy for you is going to be very based on what your objectives are. And I think with the majority of businesses that we are serving, a big part of the objectives is we want to kind of maximize the value of the business, right? A lot of the businesses in my space are, either looking for exits or they're private equity backed, and the private equity firms are going to want to, to change over at some point. So they're trying to build value and maximize that enterprise value. And recurring revenue streams are a big way of maximizing it, right? You get much better multiples on those recurring revenue streams than you do on the transactional ones. So that's one of the reasons why they're so prevalent, because they're good for doing that. What you just described to me was a situation when your objectives weren't based on long-time value, right? You're in a position when you're just starting out, you need a cash infusion to get going. Um, and sort of taking that to an extreme might be the case that if you weren't getting all that money up front, then you wouldn't be able to ever gain traction in your business, and you die out before you started, right? Not saying that's you specifically, but you could imagine a scenario when that happens.
Right.
In that case, completely different objectives, completely different pricing strategy, which is going to make sense. That said, I would still advocate for probably not doing a complete perpetual license, like you own it forever, because you're never going to get anything else out of that customer ever, right? They're going to have that price forever. I would say if you were to say, it's you pay this price and you have it for a term license, say it's like 3 years or something, at least you have
Mhm.
the opportunity then to sort of bring them in at a later time when, a lot of times in a sort of 3 year period for a growing business product market situation, everything is just completely different by that point. Then you give yourself license to come back. Maybe then you're in a position where the cash flow demands are not quite so significant, and you're ready to move to more of a recurring revenue model.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense, right? Like you said, because you might end up saying, I've bought many pieces of software where it says, "Hey, you buy this lifetime thing, and you get all the upgrades and all the other thing," and I'm like, "Well, that's great. You're not making money off of me." You know what I mean?
No,
Because if
yeah,
you go and you put in all kinds of AI upgrades and all this other stuff, and I'm never paying you another dime, okay, good. I'm glad I got this deal, but you're not really making out on this. Very
right.
interesting. So, okay, so what are some of the trends you see kind of happening now, like in the world today with how people are pricing stuff? I know we kind of talked about this level of self-selection and that kind of thing. Is there anything else that you've kind of seen as like a trend to watch or a trend to maybe emulate for people?
Yeah, I think well, one thing I'll call out, I think pricing is somewhat interesting in the sense that a lot of the issues and challenges that I see companies grappling with now are exactly the same challenges they were grappling when I got started in pricing about, 12 years ago.
Hmm.
So I think from that point of view, like a lot of the issues tend to be quite similar. That said, there are a few specific things that I'm seeing in pricing now, which are very much, specific to this time. I think firstly, there's been a big move towards hybrid business models recently. And hybrid business models are basically where you have a component of the model, which is kind of traditional subscription base in that kind of, flat month to month subscription fee, and a portion of which is usage based. So, based on the usage that the customer has. And there's loads of different ways of doing that. There's within this, there's tens of different models that you could pick. But that kind of combination of something fixed subscription like and something transactional in whatever way you do it, that seems to be something that's gaining a lot of traction. And I think it's interesting because over the last, I would say, 5-6 years, there has been more of a trend towards usage-based pricing, which we would expect because you're getting a lot more automated use cases these days. You can do more with less, and so the concept of all the value coming from how many users a company has is really, it's dying off, because one user can potentially do a lot more than one user could many years ago because of all the tools and things that they have access to. So you were seeing this movement towards usage-based pricing, and I know a lot of people looking at the market were expecting that everything is going to be fully usage-based going forward. And you did start to see that trend, but it kind of backed off, right, and ended up in these more hybrid models, which are a combination between more flat models and usage-based models. And I think it's because a few things. One is like, usage-based pricing in the way that we think about it is the kind of classic you pay as you go type idea, right? You're going to use this as much as you use it, and I'm going to charge you for exactly what you used. When you're doing that, that's not recurring revenue, right? Because you don't know what the revenue is going to be each month. So actually,
Right.
companies don't like that too much because they can't have the predictability of revenues. Doesn't help their valuations, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, a lot of the time, not always, there are some customers who like this, but a lot of the time, customers don't like that either because they can't budget for, they don't know what they're going to be paying each month. Their payments are
Yeah.
going to go up and down. You sometimes end up with some customers who kind of like that and feel like I'm only going to be paying for this when I'm actually using it and getting value out of it. But especially with larger enterprise companies who have set budgets and just like to know what something is going to be, that's a pain for them, right?
Yeah.
So now you're in a situation where you want the usage-based component because usage tends to grow and it leads you to higher revenues over time. So companies want that part of it, but they don't want the unpredictability of the revenue streams. They want recurring revenue. So these kind of hybrid models give you the best of both worlds in that sense.
Yeah. No, I see that where like you said, the usage based thing. I could see I see the benefits, the pros and the cons to it. Like as both a seller, like you said, I'm like,
Yeah.
because it's almost like your electric bill, your electricity bill, your gas bill. Like it fluctuates month to month based on what you use, which is nice in like our gas bill right now in the summer's nothing, but our electric bill from our AC running 24 hours a day has
Right.
been very, very high, right? But then
Yep.
those kind of
Exactly.
even out towards the winter, right? Or kind of switches and stuff. So um interesting. Yeah, I've not really looked a lot into. I don't have a lot of experience with the usage-based pricing and stuff. So that's very enlightening. That's very good to hear.
Absolutely.
Um, interesting, interesting. Um, sorry, I had a dead air moment here. I was
Okay.
thinking about another question, but I think you kind of already answered that earlier, so I don't think it's worth going back into. So, um, how how does one go about? I mean, there's always that dreaded price raise. You know what I mean? Like how do you go about what's a good way you've seen some people go about raising prices, especially now like inflation's going up, right?
Yeah.
Like, I've heard that before. People are like, well, hey, if you shouldn't be charging what you were charging 5 years ago for your software because just like everything else, like the grocery prices go up, the gas prices go up, and your software prices should go up. How do you do that without losing customers?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. That obviously that's one that obviously a lot of vendors are asking all the time, right? It's a pervasive thing. I think that we tend to have the opinion that if we increase our prices in a recurring revenue model, right, then all your customers are going to leave you and you're going to be left with nothing, right? And I think the overwhelming thing is like that's actually rarely the case. Usually within a certain degree of freedom, you are okay. Actually, we did some research a couple of years ago now for a particular project where we were looking at pricing increases as one of the levers that we had to pull. So we're trying to get an idea of what customers would pay. And this was at a time when inflation was around about, I think it was about 2.5%. It was before it started spiking. Um, and at that time, most of the customers, I think 80% of the customers said that a 4% year-over-year price increase would be in line with expectations, right? And they were actually, many of them were willing to pay more than that. And I don't think people would expect that, right? I think people would assume that actually, if the inflation is 2.5%, then 4% would be seen as, this is out of the question, I will not pay this. Actually, I think customers are quite used to paying more on a year by year basis. So as long as you don't go crazy and start, doing something which makes it feel like you're gouging them, they will be okay with it. And you do have to do it actually. Another client that I served recently had not raised their prices at all for about 13 years, right? They came up with their product, they offered it 13 years ago, and they had kept it flat. And it was a really interesting situation because within their customer base, there was a perception from some people that they were overcharging for what they were offering anyway, right? But then if you look at the economics of the business, when they launched the product at that price level, they were making decent margins and everything. At this point, I mean, the price levels, the costs had gone up by something like 30% within this period because of inflation and everything else. And they were basically margin neutral around this point. They were not making anything on this product. So they really, if they didn't increase their prices, they were not going to be able to sustain the business. They're really stuck in it. So I mean, I think there's a moral behind that. It is like, do not leave this many years. You should be building into your contracts, if you have a subscription model that says the price is going to go up by whatever the right number is, right? And I think the most common thing is that people say it's going to be, I'm going to take the inflation rate and add half a percentage point or a percentage point to that, just so that it keeps chugging up. So that's the way to do it on an ongoing basis. But assuming you haven't done that and you've left it and you have to move people over, I think there's a few things to do. I think one is, don't just do a blanket take it or leave it price increase to every single person within your business, right? There's gonna be within your customer base, there are going to be some people who, if you say you want to increase the price by 5%, 10%, whatever it is, they're going to be like, totally makes sense. I get tons of value out of this. I thought it was priced too low at the beginning. Very happy to pay it. There are some people who are maybe, I was really considering whether I should continue my subscription or not, and this has just pushed me over the edge and I'm leaving, right? So if you treat everybody the same, you're going to, again, under monetize a lot of them, and you're going to end up losing some of them through just mismanaging that. So the first thing is to start segmenting your customers by saying, how important are they to you? And if you serve customers with a range of sizes, or some who are paying more than others, often that is going to align with what the customer revenue is, right? Those ones who are paying you more are going to be more important to you probably than those ones who are paying you less. And those ones who are paying you closer to what they should be paying, if you think about your list prices, are maybe going to be ones that you will be a little more willing to flex on than those ones who are miles away from what they should be pricing. And then on the other axis, you think about how likely they are to accept a particular price increase, right? And that might be informed by tenure and satisfaction levels and so on and so forth. And then within each one of those segments, you then want to define a strategy that says, this is what the price increase I'm going to ask from them is. And then this is what my walkaway price increase would be if they push back. And those won't necessarily be at the same levels, right? If I have somebody who's paying way less than they should do, but they're a big customer and I know that they are dissatisfied, I might ask for 5%, but I might be willing to walk away at 0%, right? Like, I'd rather keep them than lose them.
Yeah.
Whereas there might be other ones who are small and who are paying way less than they should be paying. And I say, honestly, if I cannot get a 7% price increase from these guys, I would rather lose them as a customer and not sort of have to manage them than keep them around and have them paying something significantly less. So that strategy around that is really important. And then there are a few best practices as to how you execute that price increase as well, right? And there's a list of these things. I'll just call out a few things that I think are important. One is, the message that you give should come from a real person, right? Don't just say like, this is from the SaaS company team. That feels very impersonal. It's better if there's somebody senior at that company or a sales rep that they work directly with who can kind of give that message personally. You should be very direct about it. Don't bury the punchline deep down in this email somewhere. It should be, hey, look, we are increasing prices by this much and for this reason. All right. Just be very straightforward. Do not apologize for it. Also, I think giving customers as much notice as possible is good. All right. Customers like to know in advance when a price increase is coming rather than surprise, you're paying 20% more this month. They don't tend to like that. I have heard pushbacks on that sometimes when companies will say, well, but if I give them a lot of notice, doesn't that give them more time to shop around and find a different vendor? And the answer is kind of yes, but really, I mean, if that's not a particularly customer centric way. If the only reason you're sort of keeping a customer is because you didn't give them time to find something else, that's not going to be the basis of a good relationship. You're just going to lose them next year as opposed to losing them this year, right? And then the last thing, I think this is important, and I think this is counterintuitive to a lot of people. When we get people to start thinking about what should be the overall price level for your product, we always talk about it should be based on value and not cost, right? And that is definitely true. You should be doing that. It's a little bit different when you're doing price increases, because you got your customers who are kind of conditioned to paying a certain amount for the value of the product that you've provided. So if you go into them and say, hey, look, the product's super valuable, therefore we're going to charge more for it. They're like, well, but I was already paying what I thought was the right price for the amount of value that you were providing. So I just feel like you're charging me more, which is not fair. So that tends to not work too well. What tends to work better is if you start bringing in the concepts of fairness and cost, right? So if you're able to sort of weave in a message that says that, our costs have gone up. So the inflation example, right? We haven't raised your price for 3 years. Inflation means that our costs now are significantly higher. In order for us to continue providing the level of value that we provide to you, we need to raise our prices. That feels far more palatable to customers, right? Because then it's not just like we're charging you more because we think we're providing a lot of value to you. It's, literally we are losing out on this deal now, whereas we weren't previously, and we just need to level set the playing field. And I think customers tend to be far more on board with that kind of logic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we pay extra at, grocery stores or wherever. If you're just like, hey, the cost has to get passed on somehow, like I think people are a lot more open to that. So
Exactly, right. Exactly. Yep.
No, this has been very, very enlightening, very, very helpful on a large macro scale, for anyone in this SaaS racket of trying to, figure this game out and do these types of things. But if we want to dive a little bit deeper and kind of get a little bit more specific, what can we do?
Yep. Well, I think probably the best thing I would encourage people to do is that I actually have a book coming out in around about, we're targeting September, October for this, Dan. It's called Capturing Value. And we've written this book as a guide to somebody who works in maybe a SaaS or an anything as a service type business, who needs to transform their pricing strategy or build a pricing strategy, but just doesn't really know where to start, right? It's going to talk through all the different steps that you think about. It's going to arm you with all the information that you need to be able to think about the options that you have, but then also give you some practical steps to be able to walk through and actually build it. So it's an interesting area where a lot of people who are charged with building pricing strategies don't actually have any experience in building them. And there's not a lot of good info out there, and obviously it's somewhat risky and difficult. So the idea is that hopefully this will give people what they need to be able to do this, pretty well as a starting point within about 350 pages.
Awesome. Awesome. Very cool. Well, at the time we're recording this, that book is not out yet. We will do our best to get the link for you guys in the future when it is available in the show notes here. But you can definitely check out James, online and on his socials and everything like that. We'll put in the show notes. And this has been a very, very enlightening, very cool conversation. I knew it would be when I had you on here. So thank you so much, James. I really appreciate your insights, your knowledge, your wisdom with all of this. It's been very, very useful, very helpful. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, as I mentioned, we'll put the links for all that stuff here in the show notes below. I'm really excited to kind of get my hands on that book, Capturing Value by James, in this coming fall. That's going to be very, very interesting. But I hope you got some value out of this. I know I did. I know I learned a lot. You definitely check out James, stuff, in more depth online and everything like that. And thank him for coming on the show and providing that value. So as always, please like, rate, subscribe, and leave us a rating on the App Store or Spotify or YouTube or wherever you're listening to this show. It's been an awesome episode, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care.